The sun was a familiar weight on Elias Brennan's shoulders, a heat he had known for 23 years on this stretch of Wyoming land, a constant pressure that shaped the seasons and the man. It was the same sun that had baked the deep lines into the corners of his eyes and bleached the wood of the fence posts he'd driven into the earth with his own hands, his father's hands before him. Yet today, the light felt wrong. It was thin, brittle, casting shadows that were too sharp, too black, as if cut from dark paper and pasted onto the world. The wrongness had started 3 days ago, a subtle discordance in the familiar symphony of the ranch, a single note played off-key that grew steadily more dissonant until it was the only thing he could hear. It was the cattle. His 50 head of Holstein and Angus cross, usually a scattered constellation of black and white against the pale green of the high country pasture, were now a single, dense cluster. They stood motionless, a silent congregation on the rise that overlooked the eastern hills. They weren't grazing, they weren't chewing their cud, they weren't flicking their tails at the buzzing hordes of summer flies. They were just standing, shoulder to shoulder, their bodies forming a solid, unmoving wall of muscle and bone. And they were all staring. Every single head was turned to the east, their gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the rolling hills, beyond the jagged teeth of the distant peaks. Elias leaned against the rough-hewn rail of the corral, the wood warm beneath his calloused palm. He'd seen cattle spooked by a predator, bunched up for warmth in a sudden storm, or gathered at a gate expecting feed. This was none of those things. This was a stillness so profound it felt like a kind of worship, or a kind of terror. The air around them was heavy, dead. The usual lowing, the soft tearing of grass, the huffing breaths, all of it was gone, replaced by a silence that pressed in on him, a vacuum where the sounds of life should have been. He'd tried to break their trance. The first day, he'd driven his dusty pickup along the fence line, honking the horn. A few heads had turned, their eyes slow and milky, before swiveling back to the east, as if drawn by an irresistible magnet. Yesterday, he'd saddled his horse, Copper, a sturdy buckskin with more sense than most people, and ridden out among them. He'd yelled, slapped his rope against his leather chaps, ridden a tight circle around the herd. They'd shifted, a reluctant ripple through the mass, but not one of them had broken away. They had simply resettled, their bodies packed tight, their collective gaze returning to that same inscrutable point on the horizon. Even Bessie, his lead Holstein, the 8-year-old matriarch with a splash of white over her left eye like a fallen star, had ignored him. Bessie, who would follow the sound of his voice from a mile away, who would nudge his hand for a scratch behind the ears, had looked at him with an unnerving vacancy, as if he were no more than a phantom in her world. Her allegiance, it seemed, had shifted. That was what scared him the most. The breaking of old trusts, the severing of connections forged over years of shared seasons and mutual dependency. He was their shepherd, their provider, their anchor in the world. And now, some unseen, unheard thing had usurped him, had claimed them. He squinted toward the eastern hills. They were the same hills that had framed his sunrise every morning for 2 decades. Blue-green in the morning light, hazy purple in the dusk. Unremarkable, solid, a permanent feature of his world. There was nothing out there but scrub pine, granite outcroppings, and the long-abandoned track of an old mining road. No new structures, no strange lights, no sound he could detect. But the cattle saw something, or felt something. He pushed off the fence and walked toward the house, his boots scuffing up clouds of fine, pale dust. The screen door complained with its usual metallic groan as he pulled it open. Inside, the small kitchen was cool and smelled of old coffee and bacon grease, the comfortable scent of his solitary life. He went to the window over the sink, the one that looked out on the main pasture. The herd was still there, a dark stain on the landscape, unmoving, staring. A primal unease, cold and sharp, pricked at the base of his skull. It was a feeling older than thought, a vestigial instinct from a time when man was not the master of his domain, when the rustle in the tall grass was not a thing to be identified, but a thing to be feared implicitly. For 23 years, this land had been his partner. He knew its moods, its rhythms, its secrets. He knew the way the wind whispered through the cottonwoods before a storm, the precise shade of yellow the aspens turned in the fall, the location of every spring and every patch of loco weed. He had felt safe here, rooted. That feeling was eroding, sand washed away by a slow, invisible tide. The world he knew was tilting on its axis, and he was losing his balance. He picked up the heavy black receiver of the wall-mounted telephone. He needed to talk to someone, even if it was just to hear his own fears dismissed as foolishness. He dialed Jake Morrison's number from memory. Jake's ranch bordered his to the south, a sprawling operation that was more business than homestead. Jake was all about satellite data and feed optimization charts, a man of the modern world who would likely laugh at the notion of possessed cattle. But the sound of a human voice, any voice, felt like a necessity. The line was dead, not the staccato beep of a busy signal or the empty hum of a downed line. It was a thick, oppressive silence, the same silence that hung over the pasture. He clicked the receiver hook up and down. Nothing. Just the dead weight of it in his hand. He slammed it back into its cradle, the plastic cracking under the force. The sound was jarring in the quiet house. Fine. He didn't need Jake. He didn't need anyone. This was his land, his problem. He was Elias Brennan. He was a rancher, and he had a profound, unshakable sense of responsibility for the lives in his care. That responsibility was a heavier weight than the sun, a deeper root than any tree. It was the core of him, and it was telling him that he could no longer afford to watch and wait. The wrongness had a source, and that source was in the east. He would ride out. He would find it. He would face it. Because a shepherd did not abandon his flock, especially not when the wolf was silent and invisible. He walked to the back door, grabbing his worn felt hat from the peg. The simple act felt like a declaration of war. He was going to reclaim his world, or he was going to find out why it had been taken from him. Copper sensed it the moment Elias swung the saddle onto his back. The horse's skin twitched, a tremor that had nothing to do with flies. His ears, usually soft and responsive to Elias's movements, were pinned back, stiff with apprehension. He sidestepped in the corral, his iron-shod hooves striking sparks from a stray rock. "Easy now, boy," Elias murmured, his voice a low rumble meant to soothe them both. He ran a hand down the horse's powerful neck, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring. Copper blew out a long, shuddering breath, his nostrils wide, but he stood still as Elias cinched the saddle tight. Loyalty, Elias thought, was a currency more valuable than gold, and this horse was rich with it. He mounted in one fluid motion, a movement perfected over decades until it was as natural as breathing. From the saddle, he had a better view of the silent herd. They hadn't moved an inch. 50 stone sentinels guarding a secret he was about to uncover. He turned Copper's head, not towards the pasture gate, but towards the open range, towards the east. The horse hesitated, every muscle in his body resisting the command. He wanted to go west, back toward the barn, towards safety. "Hup," Elias said, a sharp, clipped sound. He squeezed with his knees, a firm, insistent pressure. Reluctantly, Copper broke into a trot, his gait stiff, unnatural. The familiar creak of saddle leather and the rhythmic plod of hooves were the only sounds in a world that had become unnervingly quiet. As they cleared the home pasture and began the gentle climb into the foothills, the silence deepened. The chirping of grasshoppers ceased. The meadowlarks that usually sang from fence posts were gone. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air thick and stagnant. It was like riding into a photograph, a world stripped of sound and motion. The only movement was their own, and it felt like a transgression. The higher they climbed, the stranger the landscape became. The sparse grasses grew brittle and gray, crunching under Copper's hooves like ancient paper. Patches of scrub pine appeared hunched and twisted, their needles a sickly, rust-colored brown, as if blighted by a chemical spill. Elias reached out from the saddle and broke off a small branch. The needles crumbled in his palm into a fine, acrid dust. The air began to change, too. The clean, sage-scented breeze of the high plains was replaced by a faint, unsettling odor. It was metallic and sharp, with an underlying hint of decay, like old blood and ozone. He'd smelled something similar once, long ago, after a lightning strike had hit a transformer near the barn. It was the smell of unnatural energy. Copper's breathing grew labored, his snorts coming in short, panicked bursts. His head was high, his eyes rolling, whites showing. He was fighting the bit, wanting to turn, to bolt, to flee from this tainted land. Elias kept a firm hand on the reins, his own heart hammering against his ribs in a wild, frantic rhythm. The fear was a living thing now, a cold presence that rode with him, its icy fingers trailing down his spine. This wasn't just wrongness anymore. This was a place of active malevolence. They crested a ridge, and Elias pulled Copper to a halt. The horse stood trembling beneath him, his hide slick with a sweat that was cold to the touch. Below them lay a shallow, hidden valley he had never seen before. He'd ridden these hills 100 times, thought he knew every dip and draw. But this place had been hidden, tucked away in a fold of the land that shouldn't have existed, and it was full of bones. The floor of the valley was a stark, blinding white, a carpet of skeletal remains that stretched from one end to the other. It was a graveyard of impossible scale. He could see the massive, curved ribs of buffalo, the delicate, spindly legs of pronghorn antelope, the powerful skulls of horses and elk, and cattle. Hundreds of them. Skulls upon skulls, a chaotic jumble of death that spanned centuries. Some were ancient, bleached and brittle, crumbling back into the soil. Others were newer, still holding the faint yellow of dried marrow. It was a boneyard that defied all logic. No disease, no drought, no predator could account for this. This was a place where things came to die, drawn by the same invisible force that now held his own herd in its thrall. In the exact center of the Valley of Bones, the earth gave way to a perfectly circular abyss, a sinkhole. It was perhaps 30 feet across, its edges unnaturally smooth, as if bored into the rock by a giant drill. The ground around it was black and scorched, and no bones lay within 10 feet of its rim, as if they had been repelled by some immense force. A faint, oily black vapor, like smoke but heavier, thicker, coiled up from its depths. It didn't rise and dissipate like normal smoke. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, clinging to the ground and flowing against the faint breeze, a river of shadow that seemed to drink the light. This was it, the source, the heart of the wrongness, the end point of his cattle's unwavering stare. Elias felt a pressure building in his skull, a low, subsonic hum that vibrated through his bones. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, but one he felt with his entire being. It emanated from the hole, a silent broadcast of pure dread, and woven within it, almost too faint to perceive, was another sound. A soft, wet, tearing noise. The sound of something impossibly large, feeding in the darkness below. Primal fear, raw and absolute, seized him. Every instinct screamed at him to turn, to ride as fast as Copper could carry him, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this cursed place. His hands, slick with sweat, trembled on the reins. Copper was already turning, his panic overriding Elias's command. The horse scrambled back from the ridge, kicking loose stones that clattered down into the silent valley. Elias let him go. He didn't have the strength to stop him. He clung to the saddle horn, his gaze locked on the sinkhole, the black maw that had opened up in the heart of his world. He had found the source of the evil, but the discovery brought no relief. It brought only the terrifying certainty that he was facing something ancient, something ravenous, something far beyond the scope of a solitary rancher and his horse. As Copper galloped wildly back the way they had come, Elias knew he was not retreating. He was fleeing for his life, and he had a sickening feeling that he was already too late. The ride back was a blur of frantic motion, a desperate flight from the oppressive silence and the memory of that soul-deep hum. Copper ran with the wild-eyed terror of a prey animal, his powerful lungs heaving, his hooves devouring the blighted ground. Elias didn't try to slow him. He let the horse's fear propel them, leaning low over his neck, the wind whipping tears from his eyes. The metallic smell clung to his clothes, a foul taint he couldn't escape. The world seemed to hold its breath around them, a vast, expectant stillness that promised only more horror to come. When the familiar shape of his barn finally broke the horizon, a wave of desperate relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. Home, safety, sanctuary. But the illusion shattered the moment they pounded into the yard. The oppressive atmosphere of the valley had followed them. The air was still thick, heavy, charged with the same unnatural energy. His 50 head of cattle were still in the pasture, still locked in their eastward stare. Only now a low, guttural moaning had begun to rise from them, a sound of collective, unbearable anguish. He slid from Copper's back before the horse had even come to a complete stop, his legs shaky. The horse, lathered in a fearful sweat, bolted for the relative safety of the open barn, not even waiting to be unsaddled. Elias didn't blame him. He stumbled towards the house, his mind racing. He had to get help. He had to warn someone. This was bigger than him, bigger than his ranch. Jake Morrison, the sheriff in town. Anyone. He burst through the screen door, letting it slam shut behind him, and snatched the phone from its cradle again. The silence on the line was no longer just an absence of sound. It felt like a presence, a deliberate, mocking void. He hammered the receiver hook, his knuckles white. Nothing. It was utterly, completely dead. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw its way up his throat. His truck. The old Ford was his lifeline to the outside world, a dependable beast of steel and grease. He grabbed the keys from the hook by the door and ran outside, his boots pounding on the hard-packed earth. He wrenched the driver's side door open and threw himself behind the wheel. The familiar smell of worn vinyl and spilled coffee did nothing to soothe him. He jammed the key into the ignition and turned. Click. A single, dead, metallic sound. He turned it again. Click. The battery wasn't just dead, it felt drained, inert. He slammed his fist on the dashboard, a raw cry of frustration tearing from his throat. He was cut off. A tiny island in a sea of encroaching dread. His bridges to the world burned without a single flame. A movement in the sky caught his eye. He looked east, towards the hidden valley. Rising from the ridgeline was a plume of that same oily black smoke he'd seen coiling from the sinkhole. But now it was a massive billowing column, churning and roiling as it ascended. It moved with a sickening, intelligent purpose, not drifting with the wind but flowing directly towards his ranch, a river of shadow pouring over the hills. It blotted out the pale blue of the afternoon sky, casting a premature twilight over the land. The sun, already weak and brittle, was being devoured. As the shadow of the smoke fell across the pasture, the moaning of the cattle intensified, rising in pitch and volume to a chorus of pure terror and longing. Their bodies began to shift, a restless, agonizing dance of conflicted instincts. They wanted to flee, but the call from the east held them fast. Bessie, his beautiful Bessie, let out a long, tortured bellow, a sound that ripped at Elias's heart. He could feel her pain, her confusion, her terror. She was fighting it, her powerful hooves digging into the turf, her head shaking from side to side, but it was a losing battle. Elias stood frozen between the dead truck and the silent house, a spectator to the collapse of his reality. The laws of nature, the fundamental principles he had built his life upon, were being systematically dismantled before his eyes. The sky was wrong. The air was wrong. The animals were wrong. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Night fell, not with the gentle fading of the light, but like a switch being thrown. The black smoke coalesced overhead, a thick, suffocating canopy that smothered the last vestiges of dusk and choked the stars. A profound darkness descended, a blackness so complete it felt physical, pressing in on him, stealing the very air from his lungs. The only light was a faint, sickly luminescence that seemed to emanate from the smoke itself, casting the world in a ghastly, bruised purple. And then, the cattle began to move. It wasn't a stampede, it was a march, a slow, deliberate, funereal procession. With a final, unified cry of surrender, the herd turned as one and began to walk east, directly towards the source of their torment. They moved with a chilling, fluid grace, their forms shimmering in the spectral light. "No!" Elias screamed, his voice thin and reedy against the vast, oppressive silence. He scrambled over the corral fence and ran, planting himself directly in their path. "Bessie! Get back! Get back, all of you!" They didn't slow, they didn't deviate. Their eyes, glowing with a faint internal light, were fixed on something far beyond him. They walked towards him, a wall of spectral flesh. Bessie was at the front, her head low, her steps mechanical. "Bessie, stop!" he pleaded, holding his hands out as if he could physically hold back the tide. She reached him. He braced for the impact, for the crushing weight of 1,000 pounds of bone and muscle. But there was no impact. Her shimmering form passed through him. An incandescent cold, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, flooded his body. It was the cold of the grave, the cold of empty space, the cold of a soul being scraped raw. He felt the ghostly passage of her life force, her terror, her absolute subjugation. He gasped, falling to his knees as the sensation tore through him. He watched, helpless, as the rest of the herd followed. One by one they walked through him, each passage another wave of soul-numbing cold. They reached the fence line, the sturdy barrier of wood and wire that he had so carefully maintained. They did not break it. They did not even touch it. They simply dissolved into shimmering light as they contacted the wood and reformed on the other side, never breaking stride. They were ghosts, phantoms answering a call that had shattered the very laws of physics. Elias remained on his knees in the dirt, trembling violently, the residual cold clinging to his bones. He watched the last of his herd, his life's work, his charges, fade into the unnatural darkness, marching towards the valley of bones and the waiting abyss. The terror was absolute, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush him. He was alone, his reality in ruins, his flock stolen by an impossible evil. But as the last spectral tale disappeared into the night, something else began to stir within him, deep beneath the terror. It was a familiar feeling, the one constant in his life, the bedrock of his soul. Responsibility. They were still his. And a shepherd does not abandon his flock, even if he has to follow them into hell. The decision settled in his soul not as a thought, but as a physical certainty. It was a cold, hard stone of resolve in the roiling sea of his fear. To stay here was to die, either by the encroaching malevolence or by the slow rot of cowardice. To follow was almost certainly to die as well, but it was a death with meaning. It was the fulfillment of a duty that was woven into the very fabric of his being. He would not let his animals face this alone. He rose from the ground, his body aching with a cold that felt eternal. His gaze fell upon the barn, a black silhouette against the faintly glowing smoke sky. A soft whinny, laced with terror, echoed from within. Copper. He had forgotten the horse. A wave of shame washed over him. He was not entirely alone. He walked towards the barn, each step an act of will. Inside, the darkness was thick and smelled of hay and animal fear. He found Copper huddled in the back of his stall, trembling so violently the wooden walls vibrated. "It's all right, boy," Elias whispered, his voice hoarse. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He ran a hand down the horse's flank, the muscles knotted and hard as rock. "We have one last ride to take." He didn't bother with a saddle. There was no time, and the formality seemed absurd in this broken world. He took a fistful of mane, swung himself onto Copper's bare back, and urged him out of the barn. The horse fought him, rearing, trying to retreat into the dark safety of the stall. But Elias's resolve was now an iron command, transmitted through his hands, his legs, his very presence. He was no longer a man fleeing, he was a man on a mission, and the horse sensed the shift. With a final shuddering sigh of resignation, Copper moved forward, out into the spectral twilight. They followed the ghostly trail of the herd, a faint path of disturbed energy that only they seemed able to perceive. They moved through a landscape that was both familiar and alien. His fences, his gates, the very trees he had known his whole life, seemed thin and unreal, like props on a stage. The only thing that felt solid was the oppressive darkness and the ground beneath Copper's hooves. The metallic, chemical smell grew stronger as they neared the eastern ridge, so thick it burned his nostrils and made his eyes water. The low, psychic hum from the sinkhole was now a deafening, silent roar inside his skull, a pressure that threatened to crack his sanity. They crested the ridge and looked down into the Valley of Bones. It had been transformed. The pit was no longer just a hole, it was a vortex, a swirling maelstrom of the oily black smoke, churning like a black hole had opened in the earth. The spirits of his cattle, glowing with a soft, tragic light, were circling the edge, their death march bringing them closer and closer to the abyss with each revolution. Elias could see them clearly now, not as solid beings, but as brilliant constellations of life force, their fear a visible, shimmering aura around them. He urged Copper down the slope, into the boneyard. The horse's hooves made no sound on the skeletal ground. The bones themselves seemed to writhe, stirred by the energy pouring from the pit. As he drew closer, he saw that the air within the valley was not empty. It was filled with other lights, fainter than his cattle, ancient and weary. Wisps of spectral energy twisted and coiled in the darkness, the ghostly forms of the buffalo, the horses, the elk, all the creatures whose bones littered the valley floor. They were trapped here, their spirits held in thrall for centuries, their agony a constant, low-grade fuel for the thing in the pit. Elias slid off Copper's back at the edge of the vortex. The horse stood his ground, a lone, solid creature in a world of phantoms, his loyalty finally overcoming his terror. Elias took a deep breath, the foul air searing his lungs, and stepped forward, across the invisible threshold. The world dissolved. He was not falling. He was arriving. Sensation returned in a violent, disorienting rush. He stood on a floor of living rock that seemed to breathe in slow, rhythmic pulses beneath his boots. The walls around him were a vast cyclopean amphitheater, curving up into a sky that was not a sky, but a swirling vortex of trapped light and raw, screaming energy, the souls of 1,000 consumed generations. The air was a symphony of despair, a chorus of silent shrieks that resonated directly in his mind. This was the pocket dimension, the entity's gullet. His cattle were there, floating in the center of the vast space, their spectral forms slowly dimming as their life force was siphoned away. Bessie was among them, her light fading faster than the others, her fear a beacon of exquisite flavor for the thing that had captured them. And the entity was there. It had no form, no body. It was the space itself. It was the breathing rock, the screaming sky, the oppressive, intelligent will that permeated every particle of this nightmare realm. Its consciousness pressed in on him from all sides, a weight of eons, a hunger that was ancient when the mountains were young. It was a pre-human god of consumption, a psychic parasite that had found a weak spot between worlds, a place to feed. Its voice echoed not in the air, but inside his skull, a voice made of crushed stone and dying stars. You are strong, stronger than the others. Your life burns bright. Your bond with these creatures, it gives you a unique savor. A shepherd. Elias stood his ground, his fists clenched, his jaw set. He was terrified beyond any measure he had ever known, but the cold stone of his resolve held firm. He looked at Bessie, at the dimming lights of his herd, and the terror was eclipsed by a surge of furious, protective love. They are mine, Elias thought, projecting the words with all the force of his will. The entity's consciousness seemed to smile, a cold, predatory amusement that rippled through the very rock beneath his feet. Yours? They are sustenance, as are you, but your strength, your will, it offers a possibility. The others were simple prey. You could be more. You could be a tool. Visions flooded Elias's mind, not his own memories, but images projected by the entity. He saw himself walking the earth, a conduit for the entity's power. He saw herds of animals, wild and domestic, and even columns of men, their faces blank, marching obediently into other sinkholes, other mouths that had opened across the land. He felt a surge of intoxicating power, the ability to command, to take, to be a force of nature. He was being offered a promotion, from victim to shepherd for a dark god. "Serve me," the entity's voice boomed in his mind. "Be my herdsman, gather the flocks. Your 50 will be spared. They will be returned to your pasture, solid and real. You will have them, and you will have power beyond the comprehension of your fleeting kind." A small price to pay for such a reward. A simple choice. Their lives for your service. It was the ultimate temptation. Survival. The return of everything he loved. All he had to do was surrender his soul, become the very thing he sought to destroy. He looked at the swirling, captive spirits around him, the ghosts of buffalo and ancient horses, trapped in their silent, eternal agony. He saw Bessie's light flicker, almost extinguished. He felt the entity's immense, patient hunger, a force that had been feeding for millennia and would feed for millennia more. He could save his own. That was a shepherd's duty, wasn't it? To save his flock at any cost? But the vision showed him the cost. Countless other flocks, led to the slaughter by his own hand. He would be preserving his small corner of the world by helping this thing consume the rest of it. His life had been defined by a simple, unyielding code. You care for what is yours. You stand your ground. You do not surrender your integrity for safety. His father had taught him that. The land itself had taught him that. It was a truth more solid than the breathing rock of this hellish dimension. He met the full force of the entity's consciousness with his own, a tiny spark of mortal will against an ancient, cosmic fire. He thought of the warmth of the sun on a normal day, the smell of fresh-cut hay, the soft nudge of Bessie's head against his hand. He thought of his heritage, of the splinters and scars that had built his home. And in that moment, he understood the real weapon wasn't a gun or a rope. It was the refusal to despair. The entity offered him a deal to save his herd, a bargain with the abyss. And Elias Brennan, solitary rancher, gave his answer. No. The word was not a sound. It was a detonation of pure, unadulterated will, an act of desperate defiance hurled into the heart of hopelessness. It was small, mortal, and utterly absolute. For a moment, there was nothing. The entity's vast consciousness recoiled, stunned by a response it had not encountered in millennia of consumption. It knew fear, hunger, and despair. It did not know selfless courage. And then, something impossible happened. Elias's no was a spark in a cavern of dry tinder. It was a single note of hope in a symphony of agony. The faint, swirling lights of the trapped souls, the buffalo, the ancient horses, the pronghorn, the elk, flickered. For the first time in centuries, they felt something other than the entity's psychic drain. They felt the resonance of his defiance, a pinprick of light, of choice, of rebellion. One of the ancient buffalo spirits, a massive constellation of weary light, stirred. It turned its ghostly head away from the central vortex and towards the entity's pervasive consciousness. Then another followed, and another. The spark caught. The dormant wills of thousands of consumed souls, ignited by one man's courage, began to awaken. They remembered strength. They remembered freedom. They remembered rage. A low hum started, the combined psychic energy of the awakened spirits. It grew into a roar of spectral fury. They stopped swirling. They stopped screaming their silent screams of despair. They turned, all of them, a ghostly army of the consumed, and focused their collective, stolen life force, not outward in fear, but inward, in rebellion. They turned on their captor. The entity shrieked, a sound of pure psychic agony that cracked the living rock. The black smoke of its being began to writhe and tear. It had fed on their fear for eons, but it had no defense against their hope, no shield against their unified will. It was being destroyed from within by the very souls it had imprisoned. The dimension began to collapse. The amphitheater of rock groaned, shattering into crystalline fragments. The sky vortex tore open, bleeding raw white reality into the space. Great fissures of light split the ground. Elias felt the life force of his own herd, no longer being drained, surge back into them. Their dimming lights flared bright and strong. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into pure, blinding light was the army of ancient spirits, the buffalo, the horses, the countless others, charging into the heart of the entity's darkness, a final, triumphant stampede of reclamation. They were not just destroying their prison, they were unmaking their god. The ground gave way beneath him, and he was falling, not into darkness, but into the blinding, painful, beautiful light of his own world. He landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs in a single ragged gasp. He was on his back, staring up at a sky the color of a robin's egg, cloudless and infinite. The sun was warm on his face, a gentle, healing heat, and a soft breeze carried the familiar, comforting scent of sagebrush and dry earth. He was in the valley, but it was changed. He sat up, his body a symphony of aches. The ground was covered in soft, green grass. The twisted, blighted pines on the ridge were gone, replaced by healthy, vibrant trees. The metallic smell was gone, the oppressive silence replaced by the cheerful chirping of crickets and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. He looked at the center of the valley. The sinkhole was gone. The scorched earth was gone. In its place was a patch of dark, rich soil, from which a single, impossibly green shoot was already pushing its way towards the sun. And the bones were gone. The valley was no longer a graveyard. It was just a valley, peaceful and anonymous, as if the last 1,000 years of horror had been wiped from the slate, undone by a single act of defiance. Reality had reasserted itself, stitching itself back together and leaving no scar. A soft snort made him turn his head. Copper was standing a few feet away, placidly chewing on a tuft of grass, his hide sleek and calm in the morning light. The horse looked at him with his usual intelligent, gentle eyes, the terror completely gone. And beyond him, scattered across the valley floor, were his cattle. All 50 of them. They were solid, real, their black and white hides stark and beautiful against the green. They were grazing peacefully, their tails flicking lazily at non-existent flies. At the edge of the group, Bessie lifted her head. She looked directly at Elias and let out a low, contented moo. It was the sound of normalcy, the sound of home. Tears welled in Elias's eyes, hot and sudden. He pushed himself to his feet, his stiff limbs protesting, and began to walk towards them. He didn't run, he just walked, a slow, reverent procession. As he approached, Bessie took a few steps to meet him and nudged her heavy head into his chest. He wrapped his arms around her thick neck, burying his face in her warm, familiar-smelling hide. He felt the solid, living reality of her, the steady beat of her great heart against his cheek. She was real. They were all real. They were safe. He spent a long time there, just standing among his herd, running his hands over their backs, murmuring their names, reacquainting himself with the world he had fought for. When the sun had climbed high into the sky, he knew it was time to go home. He swung himself onto Copper's bare back. Bessie fell into her lead position without a command, and the 50 head of cattle followed. The journey back was the reverse of the one before. With every step away from the healed valley, the world felt more solid, more right. The sounds of nature returned in full force, a vibrant chorus celebrating the restoration of order. As they crested the final ridge overlooking his ranch, he saw it sitting there, nestled in the land, exactly as it should be. The house, the barn, the fences. It was all there, solid and waiting. In the distance, He saw a plume of dust on the road that led to Jake Morrison's place. It was Jake's truck, moving at a normal speed, on a normal errand. Jake, on his porch with his morning coffee, oblivious, a part of a world that had almost been consumed, a world that had been saved by a secret it would never know. The sight didn't fill Elias with resentment, but with a profound sense of purpose. He led his herd back into the home pasture. They immediately spread out, grazing with a deep contentment, the memory of their ordeal seemingly wiped clean. He walked to the house, the screen door giving its familiar, friendly groan. He went to the kitchen and picked up the phone. He held the receiver to his ear and was greeted by the loud, steady drone of the dial tone. He went outside and put the key in the ignition of the Ford. The engine roared to life on the first try. The world was whole again. That evening, Elias didn't sit in his worn armchair inside. He sat on the top step of his porch, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, and watched the sun go down. The light was rich and golden, the shadows long and soft. The sky bled through 100 shades of orange and purple. It was the most beautiful sunset he had ever seen. He was not the same man who had watched the sunrise that morning. The rancher was still there, the man of soil and animal husbandry, but another man had been forged in the crucible of that dark dimension, a guardian. The land was the same, but his relationship to it had been forever altered. He was no longer just its owner, he was its custodian, the sole bearer of the terrible, wonderful secret of what lay sleeping, now sealed beneath its surface. The fear was gone, replaced not by ignorance or peace of mind, but by a vigilant calm. He had faced the abyss. He had looked into the eye of an ancient and consuming evil, and had not blinked. He had learned that a shepherd's duty was not just to his own flock, but to the principle of the flock itself, to life, to hope. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. He took a slow sip of the cold coffee. A profound peace settled over him, a peace that was not given, but earned. It was a peace built one splinter and one scar at a time, paid for with a single defiant word in the dark. His home, his life, his world. He had fought for them, and he had won. And as the first stars pricked the deep velvet of the night sky, Elias Brennan, the silent guardian, kept his watch.